Hello everyone, this is Shortsighted the Historian, and today we are returning to H.G. Wells' The Outline of History, and in particular his coverage of the 19th century. In previous videos we have looked at the mechanical and industrial revolutions, both of which really increased the level of technology available, and we have also looked at the breakdown of the order created by the Treaty of Vienna, and then the rise of nationalism in Europe, which led to the birth of Germany and Italy in the modern sense. Today, we look at the Europeans using their energy to expand outward, to colonize the rest of the world. There had been an initial phase of European colonization, but by 1850 or so, this had really petered out, as Wells makes perfectly clear. He begins by looking at the Russo-Turkish War as part of the continuing decline of the Ottoman Empire. The Russo-Turkish War, from Wells's perspective, is a great power struggle, and while he does mention that Bulgaria won independence out of this, his focus is primarily on British and French reactions to Russian interest. How Britain and France were thinking more and more of how to curb Russian influence and how to prop up the Ottomans, without really paying attention to some of the other implications in the Balkans, and especially for the peoples who are being liberated from Ottoman rule. Wells, for his part, believes in what he calls a natural political map, so he's very much a cheerleader for the liberation of different countries that had been occupied by the Turks. But oddly enough, he doesn't really focus on that too much, so it's an interesting coverage. And because it is such an outline of history rather than a thorough history, there aren't many details. We don't learn about the Battle of Shipka Pass or anything of that nature. When he goes into the second scramble, he talks a good deal about what each country got out of it, but with a heavy focus on what Britain did in India. He also, as one might predict given Wells's general views, is not a big fan of imperialism. And I have to say that his critique of imperialism is one of the better ones that I've read. While he does do some degree of moralizing, he also makes a very rational argument as to why imperialism is inherently unfeasible as practiced by the Europeans. And he observes that they did think this would be the permanent state of affairs, but only because they were short-sighted and racist. They could not predict the future because they were blinded by their own success. And he paints a very negative portrayal, but at the same time, looking at how history played out and how he predicted the reemergence of China, India, and other countries, it's hard to argue against what he says here. He was spot on. So, with all of that out of the way, I'd like to turn things over to Mr. Wells and let him explain it in his own words. He's very passionate in this section, as he was in his section where he bashed Napoleon III, because this, to him, was part of the build-up to the catastrophe that was World War I, and as such, he spares no criticism. It's also interesting in light of the fact that I recently read a couple of conservative political science books, or political theory books, I guess technically, where they were very much against open-mindedness and critique. Wells is effectively responding to people who thought like that, but during his time, and saying that it is exactly this lack of critique which leads to things like imperialism, especially imperialism which doesn't have any path forward, does a great deal of damage, and has no possibility of ultimate success. So anyway, I just found that interesting, and as I mentioned a minute ago, no further ado, here is H.G. Wells. Chapter 37, The Realities and Imaginations of the 19th Century. Section 11, The Russo-Turkish War and the Treaty of Berlin. A fresh upthrust of what we have here called the natural map against the diplomatic arrangements of the Treaty of Vienna began in 1875, when the Christian races in the Balkans, and particularly the Bulgarians, became restless and insurgent. The Turks adopted violent repressive measures and embarked upon massacres of the Bulgarians on an enormous scale. Thereupon Russia intervened 1877, and after a year of costly warfare obliged the Turks to sign the Treaty of San Stefano, which was, on the whole, a sensible treaty, breaking up the artificial Turkish Empire and to a large extent establishing the natural map. But it had become the tradition of British foreign policy to thwart the, quote, designs of Russia, heaven knows why, whenever Russia appeared to have a design. And the British Foreign Office, under the premiership of Lord Beaconsfield, intervened with the threat of war if a considerable restoration of the Turks' facilities for exaction, persecution, and massacre was not made. For a time, war seemed very probable. The British music halls, those lamps to British foreign policy, were lit with patriotic fire, and the London errand boy going his rounds was inspired to chant, with the simple dignity of a great people conscious of its high destinies, a song declaring that, "We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do, we got the ships, we got the men, we got the money too." And so to a climax, "The Russians shall not have Constantinople." In consequence of this British opposition, a conference was assembled in 1878 at Berlin to revise the Treaty of San Stefano, chiefly in the interest of the Turkish and Austrian monarchies. The British acquired the island of Cyprus, to which they had no sort of right whatever, and which has never been of the slightest use to them. And Lord Beaconsfield returned triumphantly from the Berlin Conference with what the British were given to understand at the time was peace with honor. This Treaty of Berlin was the second main factor, the Peace of Frankfurt being the first, in bringing about the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Section 12. The Second Scramble for Overseas Empire. We have suggested that in the political history of Europe between 1848 and 1878, the mechanical revolution was not yet producing any very revolutionary changes. The post-revolutionary great powers were still going on within boundaries of practically the same size and with much the same formalities as they had done in pre-revolutionary times. But where the increased speed and certainty of transport and telegraphic communications were already producing very considerable changes of condition and method was in the overseas enterprises of Britain and the other European powers, and in the reaction of Asia and Africa to Europe. The end of the 18th century was a period of disrupting empires and disillusioned expansionists. The long and tedious journey between Britain and Spain and their colonies in America prevented any really free coming and going between the homeland and the daughterlands, and so the colonies separated into new and distinct communities, with distinctive ideas and interests and even modes of speech. As they grew, they strained more and more at the feeble and uncertain link of shipping that joined them. Weak trading posts in the wilderness, like those of France and Canada, or trading establishments in great alien communities, like those of Britain and India, might well cling for bare existence to the nation which gave them support and a reason for their existence. That much, and no more, seemed to many thinkers in the early part of the 19th century to be the limit set to overseas rule. In 1820, the sketchy great European empires outside of Europe that had figured so bravely in the maps of the middle 18th century had shrunken to very small dimensions. Only the Russians sprawled as large as ever across Asia. It sprawled much larger in the imaginations of many Europeans than in reality, because of their habit of studying the geography of the world upon Mercator's projection, which enormously exaggerated the size of Siberia. The British Empire in 1815 consisted of the thinly populated coastal river and lake regions of Canada, and a great hinterland of wilderness in which the only settlements as yet were the fur trading stations of the Hudson Bay Company, about a third of the Indian Peninsula under the rule of the East India Company, the coast districts of the Cape of Good Hope, inhabited by blacks and rebellious-spirited Dutch settlers, a few trading stations on the west coast of Africa, the Rock of Gibraltar, the island of Malta, Jamaica, a few minor slave labor possessions in the West Indies, British Guiana, and South America, and on the other side of the world, 2 dumps for convicts at Botany Bay in Australia and in Tasmania. Spain retained Cuba, and a few settlements in the Philippine Islands. Portugal had in Africa some vestiges of her ancient claims. Holland had various islands and possessions in the East Indies and Dutch Guiana, and Denmark an island or so in the West Indies. France had one or two West India islands and French Guiana. This seemed to be as much as the European powers needed or were likely to acquire of the rest of the world. Only the East India Company showed any spirit of expansion. In India, as we have already told, a peculiar empire was being built up not by the British peoples nor by the British government, but by this company of private adventurers with their monopoly and royal charter. The company had been forced to become a military and political power during the years of Indian division and insecurity that followed the breakup of India after the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. It had learnt to trade in states and peoples during the 18th century. Clive founded and Warren Hastings organized this strange new sort of empire. French rivalry was defeated, as we have already told, and by 1798, Lord Mornington, afterwards the Marquis Wellesley, the elder brother of that General Wellesley who became the Duke of Wellington, became Governor-General of India, and set the policy of that company definitely upon the line of replacing the fading empires of the Grand Mogul by its own rule. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt was a direct attack upon the empire of this British company. While Europe was busy with the Napoleonic Wars, the East India Company, under a succession of governors-general, was playing much the same role in India that it had been played before by Turkoman and such like invaders from the north, but playing it with greater efficiency and far less violence and cruelty. And after the Peace of Vienna, it went on, levying its revenues, making wars, sending ambassadors to Asiatic powers, a quasi-independent state, a state, however, with a marked disposition to send wealth westward. In a previous chapter, we have sketched the breakup of the empire of the Great Mogul, and the appearance of the Maratha states, the Rajput principalities, the Muslim kingdoms of Oud and Bengal, and the Sikhs. We cannot tell here in any detail how the British company made its way to supremacy, sometimes as the ally of this power, sometimes of that, and finally as the conqueror of all. Its power spread to Assam, Sindh, Oud. The map of India began to take on the outlines familiar to the English schoolboy of today, a patchwork of native states embraced and held together by the great provinces under direct British rule. Now, as this strange, unprecedented empire of the company grew in the period between 1800 and 1858, the mechanical revolution was quietly abolishing the great distance that had once separated India and Britain. In the old days, the rule of the company had interfered little in the domestic life of the Indian states. It had given India foreign overlords, but India was used to foreign overlords and had hitherto assimilated them. These Englishmen came into the country young, lived there most of their lives, and became a part of its system. But now, the mechanical revolution began to alter this state of affairs. It became easier for the British officials to go home and have holidays in Europe, easier for them to bring out wives and families. They ceased to be Indianized. They remained more conspicuously foreign and Western, and there were more of them. And they began to interfere more vigorously with Indian customs. Magical and terrible things like the telegraph and the railway appeared. Christian missions became offensively busy. If they did not make very many converts, at least they made skeptics among the adherents of the older faiths. The young men in the towns began to be Europeanized, to the great dismay of their elders. India had endured many changes of rulers before, but never the sort of changes in her ways that these things portended. The Muslim teachers and the Brahmins were alike alarmed, and the British were blamed for the progress of mankind. Conflicts of economic interest grew more acute with the increasing nearness of Europe. Indian industries, and particularly the ancient cotton industry, suffered from legislation that favored the British manufacturer. A piece of incredible folly on the part of the company precipitated an outbreak. To the Brahmin, a cow is sacred. To the Muslim, the pig is unclean. A new rifle, needing greased cartridges, which the men had to bite, was served out to the company's Indian soldiers. The troops discovered that their cartridges were greased with the fat of cows and swine. This discovery precipitated a revolt of the company's Indian army, the Indian Mutiny, 1857. First the troops mutinied at Meerut. Then Delhi rose to restore the empire of the Great Mogul. The British public suddenly discovered India. They became aware of that little garrison of British people, far away in that strange land of fiery dust and wearying sunshine, fighting for life against dark multitudes of assailants. How they got there and what right they had there, the British public did not ask. The love of one's kin and danger override such questions. There were massacres and cruelties. 1857 was a year of passionate anxiety in Great Britain. With mere handfuls of troops, the British leaders, and notably Lawrence and Nicholson, did amazing things. They did not sit down to be besieged while the mutineers organized and gathered prestige. That would have lost them India forever. They attacked, often against overwhelming odds. "Clubs, not spades, are trumps," said Lawrence. The Sikhs, Gurkhas, the Punjab troops stuck to the British. The South remained tranquil. Of the massacres of Cawnpur and Lucknow and Oudh, and how a greatly outnumbered force of British troops besieged and stormed Delhi, other histories must tell. By April 1859, the last embers of the blaze had been stamped out, and the British were masters of India again. In no sense had the mutiny been a popular insurrection. It was a mutiny merely of the Bengal army, due largely to the unimaginative rule of company officials. Its story abounds in instances of Indian help and kindness to British fugitives. But it was a warning. The direct result of the mutiny was the annexation of the Indian Empire to the Crown of Britain. By the act entitled An Act for the Better Government of India, the Governor-General became a viceroy representing the sovereign, and the place of the company was taken by a Secretary of State for India, responsible to the British Parliament. In 1877, Lord Beaconsfield, to complete this work, caused Queen Victoria to be proclaimed Empress of India. Upon these extraordinary lines, India and Britain were linked until after the Second World War. India was still the empire of the Great Mogul, expanded, but the Great Mogul had been replaced by the Crowned Republic of Great Britain. India became an autocracy without an autocrat. Its rule combined the disadvantage of absolute monarchy with the impersonality and irresponsibility of democratic officialdom. The Indian with a complaint to make had no visible monarch to go to. His emperor was a golden symbol. He must circulate pamphlets in England or inspire a question in the British House of Commons. The more occupied Parliament was with British affairs, the less attention India received, and the more she was at the mercy of her small group of higher officials. This was manifestly impossible as a permanent state of affairs. Indian life, whatever its restraints, was moving forward with the rest of the world. India had an increasing service of newspapers, an increasing number of educated people affected by Western ideas, and an increasing sense of common grievance against her government. There had been little or no corresponding advance in the education and quality of the British official in India during the century. His tradition was a high one. He was often a man of exceptional quality, but the system was unimaginative and inflexible. Moreover, the military power that stood behind these officials had developed neither in character nor intelligence during the century. No other class had been so stagnant intellectually as the British military caste. Confronted with a more educated India, the British military man, uneasily aware of his educational defects and constantly apprehensive of ridicule, displayed a growing disposition towards spasmodic violence that has had some very lamentable results. A sort of countenance was given to the lack of knowledge and self-control by the forcible teachings of Mr. Kipling, to which we have already made allusion. The growth of the British Empire in directions other than that of India was by no means so rapid during the earlier half of the 19th century. A considerable school of political thinkers in Britain was disposed to regard overseas possessions as a source of weakness to the kingdom. The Australian settlements developed slowly until in 1842 the discovery of valuable copper mines, and in 1851 of gold gave them a new importance. Improvements in transport were also making Australian wool an increasingly marketable commodity in Europe. Canada, too, was not remarkably progressive until 1849. It was troubled by dissensions among its French and British inhabitants. There were several serious revolts, and it was only in 1867 that a new constitution creating a federal dominion of Canada relieved its internal strains. It was the railway that altered the Canadian outlook. It enabled Canada, just as it enabled the United States, to expand westward, to market its corn and other produce in Europe, and in spite of its swift and extensive growth, to remain in language and sympathy and interest one community. The railway, the steamship, and the telegraphic cable were indeed changing all the conditions of colonial development. Before 1840, English settlements had already begun in English New Zealand, and a New Zealand land company had been formed to exploit the possibilities of the island. In 1840, New Zealand also was added to the colonial possessions of the British Crown. Canada, as we have noted, was the first of the British possessions to respond richly to the new economic possibilities the new methods of transport were opening. Presently, the republics of South America, and particularly the Argentine Republic, began to feel, in their cattle trade and coffee growing, the increased nearness of the European market. Hitherto, the chief commodities that had attracted European powers in unsettled and barbaric regions had been gold or other metals, spices, ivory, or slaves. But in the latter quarter of the 19th century, the increase of the European population was obliging their governments to look abroad for staple foods. And the growth of scientific industrialism was creating a demand for new raw materials, fats and greases of every kind, rubber, and other hitherto disregarded substances. It was plain that Great Britain and Holland and Portugal were reaping a great and growing commercial advantage from their very considerable control of tropical and subtropical products. After 1871, Germany, and presently France, and later Italy, began to look for unannexed raw material areas, or for Oriental countries capable of profitable modernization. So began a fresh scramble all over the world, except in the American region where the Monroe Doctrine now barred such adventures, for politically unprotected lands. Close to Europe was the continent of Africa, full of vaguely known possibilities. In 1850 it was a continent of black mystery. Only Egypt and the coast were known. A map must show the greatness of the European ignorance at that time. It would need a book as long as this outline to do justice to the amazing story of the explorers and adventurers who first pierced this cloud of darkness, and to the political agents, administrators, traders, settlers, and scientific men who followed in their track. Wonderful races of men like the pygmies, strange beasts like the okapi, marvelous fruits and flowers and insects, terrible diseases, astounding scenery of forest and mountain, enormous inland seas, and gigantic rivers and cascades were revealed. A whole new world, even remains at Zimbabwe, of some unrecorded and vanished civilization. The southward enterprise of an early people were discovered. Into this new world came the Europeans and found the rifle already there in the hands of the Arab slave traders, and Negro life in disorder. By 1900, all Africa was mapped, explored, estimated, and divided between the European powers, divided with much snarling and disputation into portions that left each power uneasy or discontented, but which, see map, remained much the same till 1914. Little heed was given to the welfare of the natives in this scramble. The Arab slaver was indeed curbed rather than expelled, but the greed for rubber, which was a wild product collected under compulsion by the natives in the Belgian Congo, a greed exacerbated by the pitiless avarice of the king of the Belgians, and the clash of inexperienced European administrators with the native population, led to horrible atrocities. No European power has perfectly clean hands in this matter. We cannot tell here in any detail how Great Britain got possession of Egypt in 1883, and remained there in spite of the fact that Egypt was technically a part of the Turkish Empire. nor how nearly this scramble led to a war between France and Great Britain in 1898, when a certain Colonel Marchand, crossing Central Africa from the west coast, tried at Fashada to seize the Upper Nile. In Uganda, the French Catholic and British Anglican missionaries disseminated a form of Christianity so heavily charged with the spirit of Napoleon, and so finely insistent upon the nuances of doctrine, that a few years after its first glimpse of European civilization, Mengo, the capital of Uganda, was littered with dead Protestants and Catholics extremely difficult to distinguish from the entirely unspiritual warriors of the old regime. Nor can we tell how the British government first let the Boers, or Dutch settlers of the Orange River District in the Transvaal, set up independent republics in the inland parts of South Africa, and then repented and annexed the Transvaal Republic in 1877. Nor how the Transvaal Boers fought for freedom, and won it after the Battle of Majuba Hill, 1881. Majuba Hill was made to rankle in the memory of the English people by a persistent press campaign. A war with both republics broke out in 1899, a 3 years war enormously costly to the British people, which ended at last in the surrender of the two republics. Their period of subjugation was a brief one. In 1907, after the downfall of the imperialistic government which had conquered them, the Liberals took the South African problem in hand, and these former republics became free and fairly willing associates with Cape Colony and the Natal in a confederation of all the states of South Africa as one self-governing republic under the British Crown. In a quarter of a century, the partition of Africa was completed. There remained unannexed 3 comparatively small countries: Liberia, a settlement of liberated Negro slaves on the west coast; Morocco, under a Muslim sultan; and Abyssinia, a barbaric country with an ancient and peculiar form of Christianity, which had successfully maintained its independence against Italy at the Battle of Adowa in 1896. Section 13. The Indian Precedent in Asia. It is difficult to believe that any large number of people really accepted this headlong painting of the map of Africa in European colors as a permanent new settlement of the world's affairs. But it is the duty of the historian to record that it was so accepted. There was but a shallow historical background to the European mind in the 19th century, hardly any sense of what constitutes an enduring political system, and no habit of penetrating criticism. The quite temporary advantages that the onset of the mechanical revolution in the West had given the European grand powers over the rest of the old world were regarded by people blankly ignorant of the great Mongol conquest of the 13th and following centuries as evidences of a permanent and assured European leadership of mankind. They had no sense of the transferability of science and its fruits. They did not realize that Chinamen and Indians could carry on the work of research as ably as Frenchmen or Englishmen. They believed that there was some innate intellectual drive in the West and some innate indolence and conservatism in the East that assured the Europeans a world predominance forever. The consequence of this infatuation was that the various European foreign offices set themselves not merely to scramble with the British for the savage and undeveloped regions of the world's surface, but also to carve up the populous and civilized countries of Asia as though these peoples also were no more than raw material for European exploitation. The inwardly precarious but outwardly splendid imperialism of the British ruling class in India, and the extensive and profitable possessions of the Dutch in the East Indies, filled the ruling and mercantile classes of the rival great powers with dreams of similar glories in Persia, in the disintegrating Ottoman Empire, and in further India, China, and Japan. In the closing years of the 19th century, it was assumed, as the reader may verify by an examination of the current literature of the period, to be a natural and inevitable thing that all the world should fall under European dominion. With a reluctant, benevolent air, the European mind prepared itself to take up what Mr. Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden. That is to say, the lordship of the earth. The powers set themselves to this enterprise in a mood of jostling hostility, with half-educated or illiterate populations at home, with a mere handful of men, a few thousand at most, engaged in scientific research, with their internal political systems in a state of tension or convulsive change, with a creaking economic system of the most provisional sort, and with their religions far gone in decay. They really believed that the vast population of Eastern Asia could be permanently subordinated to such a Europe. Even today, there are many people who fail to grasp the essential facts of the situation. They do not realize that in Asia, the average brain is not one whit inferior in quality to the average European brain, that history shows Asiatics to be as bold, as vigorous, as generous, as self-sacrificing, and as capable of strong collective action as Europeans, and that there are, and must continue to be, a great many more Asiatics than Europeans in the world. It has already been difficult to restrain the leakage of knowledge from one population to another, and now it becomes impossible. Under modern conditions, worldwide economic and educational equalization is in the long run inevitable. An intellectual and moral rally of the Asiatics is going on at the present time. The slight leeway of a century or so, a few decades, may recover. At the present time, for instance, for one Englishman who knows Chinese thoroughly or has any intimate knowledge of Chinese life and thought, there are hundreds of Chinamen conversant with everything the English know. The balance of knowledge in favor of India may be even greater. To Britain, India sends students. To India, Britain sends officials, for the most part men untrained in scientific observation. There is no organization whatever for the sending of European students, as students, to examine and inquire into Indian history, archaeology, and current affairs, or for bringing learned Indias into contact with British students in Britain. Since the year 1898, the year of the seizure of Kiaochao by Germany and Weihai Wei by Britain, and the leasing of Port Arthur to Russia, events in China have moved more rapidly than in any other country except Japan. A great hatred of Europeans swept like a flame over China. In a political society for the expulsion of Europeans, the Boxers grew up and broke out into violence in 1900. This was an outbreak of rage and mischief on quite old-fashioned lines. In 1900, the Boxers murdered 250 Europeans and, it is said, nearly 30,000 Christians. China, not for the first time in history, was under the sway of a dowager empress. She was an ignorant woman, but of great force of character and in close sympathy with the Boxers. She supported them, and protected those who perpetrated outrages on the Europeans. All that, again, is what might have happened in 500 BC or thereabouts against the Huns. Things came to a crisis in 1900. The Boxers became more and more threatening to the Europeans in China. Attempts were made to send up additional European guards to the Peking legations, but this only precipitated matters. The German minister was shot down in the streets of Peking by a soldier of the Imperial Guard. The rest of the foreign representatives gathered together and made a fortification of the more favorably situated legations and stood a siege of 2 months. A combined Allied force of 20,000 under a German general then marched up to Peking and relieved the legations, and the empress fled to Xianfu, the old capital of Taisung and Shenxi. Some of the European troops committed grave atrocities upon the Chinese civil population. That brings one up to about the level of 1850, let us say. There followed the practical annexation of Manchuria by Russia, a squabble among the powers, and in 1904 a British invasion of Tibet, hit hereto a forbidden country. But what did not appear on the surface of these events, and what made all these events fundamentally different, was that China now contained a considerable number of able people who had a European education and European knowledge. The Boxer insurrection subsided, and then the influence of this new factor began to appear in talk of a constitution, 1906, and the suppression of opium smoking, and in educational reforms. A constitution of the Japanese type came into existence in 1909, making China a limited monarchy. But China is not to be molded to the Japanese pattern, and the revolutionary stir continued. Japan, in her own reorganization, and in accordance with her temperament, had turned her eyes to the monarchist West, but China was looking across the Pacific. In 1911, the essential Chinese Revolution began. In 1912, the emperor abdicated, and the greatest community in the world became a republic. The overthrow of the emperor was also the overthrow of the Manchus, and the Mongolian pigtail, which had been worn by the Chinese since 1644, ceased to be compulsory upon them. At the present time, it is probable that there is more good brain matter and more devoted men working out the modernization and the reorganization of the Chinese civilization than we should find directed to the welfare of any single European people. China will presently have a modernized practicable script, a press, new and vigorous modern universities, a reorganized industrial system, and a growing body of scientific and economic inquiry. The natural industry and ingenuity of her vast population will be released to cooperate upon terms of equality with the Western world. She has great internal difficulties ahead of her yet. Of that, no man can judge. A phase of civil war and commotion is inevitable. Nevertheless, the time may not be very distant when the Federated States of China may be at one with the United States of America in a pacified and reconciled Europe and upholding the organized peace of the world.